One of the big issues that we talk about in the history of science and technology is the idea of the spread of technology in particular, but also ideas. So not only the product of scientific ideas, but science and the ideas of science itself. In the last 2 weeks, we've been talking about the early river civilizations and their use of technology in service of the state. So looking particularly for the kind of research that a state would support, the pharaoh, the king of Babylonia, in order to get useful technology, useful engineering, whether it's for irrigation or for defense or for writing, keeping records, etc. Right? In the Greek times, we also looked at the idea of science for its own sake. So in this next video here, this PowerPoint presentation, we're talking about a little bit about this controversy in the history of science and technology over the spread of ideas, the spread of technology. Sometimes your authors in McClellan and Dorn will talk about how certain technologies were homegrown, that they came from the peoples of that area without any connection with other societies. Sometimes they'll suggest that perhaps connection with other societies indeed spurred on these ideas. So one of the things we're going to take a look at here is this idea of communication, a technology itself, whether it's writing or it's language, or even the idea of travel, right? Travel and communication. So what we're going to look at is that idea of cultural diffusion, technological diffusion, the diffusion of ideas, but also keeping in mind that in some cases this diffusion didn't happen very quickly. It didn't happen in a century, even maybe perhaps a millennium. Still, some interesting ideas here to take a look at in the spread of science, society, and technology, looking at global communications, wrapping up this period of ancient and medieval times. So you'll remember this map. We've seen it enough times now. And this is our early map suggesting the spread of Homo sapiens sapiens. And as you can see, if you accept the theory that our first example of Homo sapiens sapiens is in Africa in the 200,000 years ago, and there's really very little evidence to refute this. This is most likely the case. And you see how very slow but steady the diffusion of Homo sapiens sapiens was as they traveled, multiplied, moved throughout the course of the globe. So a very slow development here over time. And again, we think this is primarily because life expectancy was short. Most folks in the Paleolithic era were primarily hunters and gatherers and just barely replacing themselves population-wise. So we have very little leisure time. As we have indicated, that leisure time in the development of science technology is very important for you need leisure time from basic food gathering to try to develop new ideas, new technologies. On the other hand, new technologies can enhance the size of your food supply. So it's an interesting combination, this idea of leisure, technology, and food supply, that they all very much go together. When we're thinking about communication in antiquity, one of the first things we look to is waterways, and we've already talked about this with regard to Mesopotamia, with regard to Egypt. Not only were these great rivers important for providing the water necessarily to engage in great agricultural endeavors, this is part of that hydraulic hypotheses that McClellan and Dorn say. Without great riverways, without the technology to enhance and to manipulate those riverways, we would not have had urban civilization, and we would not have seen the history of human civilization develop as it did. So that whole idea of the technological innovations that help us to control our water supply led to great developments in civilization, but also helped to define how those developments would come about. So controlling and manipulating a natural resource such as water. This is an image from China. We don't have a lot of time in this class to go beyond the Western tradition, and this is modern China, as you can see, but water transportation in modern China, just as in ancient China, very important for moving products and people, and then therefore ideas from place to place within a given region. We also haven't had a lot of time to look at India. Again, McClellan and Dorn will devote whole chapters just to India and to China. And in India, we have these great roadways. These were crafted by the king Ashoka, probably in the 3rd century BC. And you don't really see roadways per se, but what you see instead are road markers. So we have these pillars, these rock edicts, if you will, these stone markers along roadways. Ashoka was a Buddhist, and what he also did when he crafted roadways throughout India, he was one of the first kings to unite all of India, so he crafts roadways to not only unite his country, but as a practicing Buddhist, every time you see one of these stone markers or one of these great pillars, he also would include a saying of the Buddha, and he would place these in lovely little parks, what we might call sort of state rest areas along the highways, right? So if you're on a state highway and you come across a rest area, it's green, it has some shade for your lunch, etc. And so that's what he sort of did, is along the highways and byways of India, he spread the philosophy of Buddha at these little rest stops. So again, the idea of roadways connecting a society, connecting a country, allowing for the transportation of goods and services, but also ideas, in this case, the ideas of the Buddha. Probably one of the greatest one of the greatest road builders in society were the Romans. And the Romans, again, as we've said before in some of these ancient societies, typically states harness technology in order to maintain the state, in order to keep the state going. And road building was very important to the Romans. This map that you have here shows the extensive road building in the state of Italy itself. But you have to remember that the Roman Empire was extensive, and it was covering much of the land that surrounds the Mediterranean Sea, so southern Europe, North Africa, Spain, the Middle East. We think various estimates between 20,000 and 50,000 miles of roads that the Romans built. What's fun to look at, and I think I told you earlier, I was just in Rome, and these flagstones, these kinds of Roman roads, very much in evidence even today in Italy. And the thing that's nice about the Romans and nice about their road building is that they were systematically done. So no matter where you go in the Roman Empire, the roads were exactly the same. The story is that all roads lead to Rome. Sorry, it's early, still suffering from a little jet lag. All roads lead to Rome. But some of my professors would suggest actually that all roads lead away from Rome, so that Rome, the center of their world, could communicate, certainly in this case with northern and southern Italy, but then also all throughout that empire. The Chinese also were good road builders. They too believed that the roads ought to be systematic. And all the roads, just as in Rome, were the same width and served to connect the peoples of China, also a great empire at one point, also a great region of peoples of great diversity in language, great diversity in geography. Again, McClellan and Dorn will go through this, but the idea was in China to be able to get goods and resources from one place in China to the other. So very early on, again, 3rd century BC, we get a systematic approach to road building in China. The Chinese also developed a canal system. So just as we were talking about the idea of controlling water around us, the Chinese also developed a canal system. You may know a little bit about Chinese geography, great river systems. Here is the Yellow River up here. Here to the south, the Yangtze, the Mekong going into Vietnam. Right, so we have all of these amazing rivers, and there are more besides. There's some 6 different rivers, not all mapped out on this particular presentation here. But the major rivers go from west, up here in the mountains, to east. So they flow from the west to the east, flowing into the sea. The first emperor of China began the process, and that process continued into the modern era, but the first emperor of China began the process of trying to harness the power of this river in order to craft a canal that would go north to south. So we've got plenty of rivers for transporting peoples and goods from west to east, and that's the flow of the river, but could we also have transportation on water from north to south? And so they developed an engineering scheme that harnessed the water flow to help move traffic north and south as well. So an amazing ability of the Chinese to develop, to harness a lot of labor and to control elements in nature for their own services. The Great Wall of China depicted here was certainly a wall for defensive purposes, but as you can see from the people walking up and down this edifice as well, it was also a pathway, it was a footway, it was a road that you could move carts, you could move horses, you could move people up and down it. Every 20 miles or so, there is at least 20 miles, it may be even shorter, there's a guardhouse. And this is where this hill is coming up to. You don't see it in this image. There's a guardhouse. So you had the ability after one day's march or labor to find some kind of shelter. And it was a manned guardhouse. There would be someone there to either help you with your concerns or defend against the north. Again, up here to the north are the Mongols. Here to the south is China. And again, you can see the road continuing over this area here. Another great conduit of communication, of travel, and this is one that is going from civilization to civilization. We saw the Egyptian river, we saw the Chinese rivers, canals, and roads, the Roman roads throughout the Mediterranean region, way over here, lots of Roman roads over here. The Silk Road is an amazing network of cities and tradesmen that gets you from China, right, or to China, depending on what the case may be, all the way to the Roman Empire. And it is during, at least we think, probably the 2nd century BC, certainly later, that Chinese emperors are aware that there is this trade route that's happening, this international, global trade that's happening between East and West. And this is fascinating in the history of China. We think there was no particular emperor or great state that encouraged this. No, this was actually individuals trying to get goods to market that over time crafted a route to do so. So you see all of these different cities here in China moving into Western Asia, Afghanistan, moving into Persia, then to the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, to the Middle East, Egypt, and again eventually to Constantinople, this great city in the Roman Empire, and then also Rome itself. We know that in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD that noble Roman women were wearing gowns made of silk from China. We know that silk traded in China at a much lower price than it did in Rome. So, for example, you could pay a Chinese general for his services, right? And you would have to pay him 10 bolts of good Chinese silk for an annual wage, say. But over here in Rome, 1 bolt of silk could go for just the equivalent of 10 in China for how far it would trade. So that was the value added, if you will, to get it from China to Rome. So 1 bolt of silk on the Roman market worth 10 times what it would be worth in China, where the supply was large. You can see that this route also goes overseas, and that's an indication that our sailing technology is getting stronger as we move into the 1st and 2nd millennia AD. And so what we're seeing here is connecting China and India and eventually Muslim Arabia and Iran, Iraq, to the Mediterranean. So not only does this route exist during the ancient world, it also exists in the medieval period. It will be this source of supply of the spices from India, the silks and other exotic from China that will inspire Europeans to attempt to understand the technology and the science necessary to navigate the globe by sea. So just one of the extraordinary examples of communications, of transferring of goods, but also technology from one continent to another. Your book will also go into the Americas, and again, we won't have time to go into all of these civilizations in this class this summer, but we'd be remiss in an essay or a discussion on roads, not to mention the Incan roads. The Inca in Latin America, will eventually become Latin America, in South America, as you can see from this map, constructed a series of roads that helped them to traverse the Andes Mountains. This civilization, to the north, a capital called Quito, yes, all the way to this very extraordinary high mountain center, and perhaps another capital of Cusco and Machu Picchu, perhaps ceremonial centers, all the way down to modern-day Santiago. This is an extraordinarily long culture, much like, say, the Egyptians, and it is a mountain culture. And the folks of Peru, the Inca of Peru, the leaders of Peru, put together a network of roads in order to traverse this region. One of the extraordinary features of this road system is the rope bridge. The Inca had lots of mountainous areas to go over, and on occasion it would be more efficient to craft a bridge. There were a group of NOVA engineers that PBS, the Public Broadcasting System, put on not too long ago, and they were trying to recreate with ancient Incan technology how you get this bridge across. And they said that they could do it in a day. What they had to do was go to a local village that was still living in Peru, much as their ancestors had, and they started on one side. One fellow will take a guideline, if you will, a single rope, and go down into the valley, figure out a way to get it over here, right? And then as they do, they will stretch the guide rope way. While he's doing that, this entire village over here is essentially weaving a bridge, crafting a bridge with knots, with weaving, etc. And as that guide rope gets over there, they attach the bridge to it, and then slowly but surely, another village over here is pulling this thing across. So it takes two villages. It takes one day to bridge such a chasm. So very efficient use of labor. We talked about how the Silk Road went by sea. The Romans, too, traveled by sea, primarily in the Mediterranean. And while the Silk Road was connecting the Chinese and the Indians and the Muslims and eventually the Romans, both east and west, in a much smaller sort of a way, the Romans by sea were connecting Africa, Egypt, the Middle East, and that includes Babylon, and Europe, to each other through the seas. The Romans were very famous for their seafaring within the Mediterranean, but also very famous for clearing the seas of piracy. When you start to build roads, when you start to have travel and trade along waterways, one of the things we seem to attract are brigands and pirates. And so the Romans were very good at putting down that kind of detriment to communication. Again, keeping in mind that all of these trade communications are also excellent communication for ideas, technology, language. As we move into the European era, and that's where we're headed this particular week, we also would be remiss if we didn't mention the Vikings. The Vikings, a very interesting group out of Northern Europe, great sailors. They built amazing ships that could go both on the open ocean and in rivers. They were unique in that they would draw, D-R-A-W, they would draw only 6 inches of water when launched. So that means you could go into very shallow areas like rivers and still have a ship loaded down with a good 20, 30-member crew. The same ship was very stable in open seas. Again, the Vikings, very good sailors, very good shipbuilders. They were able to bring their culture to Europe, to Russia, to England, Ireland, and Scotland. Again, an image of one of their boats that's been maintained, survived archaeologically to be restored and put on display. And you can see how open they are, these boats, very open to the elements, and probably held again about 20 to 30 crew members at the most, had a sail for sailing, but also very limited cargo hold underneath the floor there, and drew very little water once launched, so a very shallow boat. So we've been talking about these different cultures. We've been trying to pull together a history of science and technology from the beginning of time up until the modern era. And this is indeed a monumental task to try to achieve. But one of the interesting things that we need to remember is that technology, as it's developed in one civilization, oftentimes it's very rare for that technology to be lost. It's very rare for people to forget technology. Once you figure out how to use a level, once you figure out how to use a pulley, a lever, once you figure out how to use gunpowder, it's very difficult for that technology to be lost. And so once one group has a particular kind of technology, another group will want it. The silk trade was very popular. We mentioned the Silk Road. It will take time, and it will take about 1,000 years. But about 1,000 years after the Romans first came in contact with silk, the Romans in Constantinople were starting to manufacture it. It took them a while to figure out the secret, but they do find that out and start to craft it. Yeah. So the spread of technology, the spread of knowledge. We've talked about the Greeks and their idea. Greeks were great sailors. Greeks come up with an approach to science that is abstract. That knowledge will be written down. That knowledge will be shared. It will be preserved through fits and starts, even though the Greeks themselves may not be a dominant society in the Mediterranean. The Romans will take up that Greek tradition and use it for themselves and spread it all the places they go, the places their roads take them, all the places their waterways take them. The Silk Road of China will not only spread, as we've said before, goods primarily from China to the rest of the world and back the other way, but the Chinese, as we'll see in a moment, were developing some extraordinary technologies that other folks did not have. And it is through the Silk Road, through trade, that these things will come to Europe. Things like the rudder for large ships, things like gunpowder, things like paper and a printing press with movable type. There are a lot of things that the Chinese will develop much earlier than the Europeans, and through trade will make its way to Europe. Islam. Islam is a society that develops in the late antique, early Middle Ages era, in the 600s and the 700s. And one of the things that will happen with Islam is we'll have an urban society where we'll continue the idea that the Greeks had of places of learning, right? Places of learning. And one of the things that the Muslims will preserve are Greek ideas. Greek ideas like that Aristotle put forth about the cosmos. They will, in addition to that, have great trade negotiations with India. And as they do so, they will pick up certain things in mathematics. The number 0 will come from India. The idea of Arabic numerals, the Indian Sanskrit numerals will actually be adopted by Arabic traders, and they will become Arabic numerals as we understand them. So that gift to the world of math, what will be algebra, a good Arabic word, comes from Islam's trade and communication with India, and India's use of the 0, India's use of the so-called Arabic numerals. And we've already talked about European trade routes as well. Just a little bit. We talked a little about the Vikings. We'll talk more about the Netherlands and this idea of the Age of Discovery as Europe comes into her own as a civilization as well. This map is meant to show you, again, how far the Vikings got around in Europe. And as you can see, these blue lines show you that they got into Russia over here. Probably Vikings were the first to settle Kiev and create that as a city. They moved into England and have great influence here in the north of England. And then we can see them here in France, in Ireland, and then, yes, in Iceland, Greenland, and even over into North America. And then we have this image here, which I think is a nice one. It's showing, as we move into the Middle Ages, how very complex life is getting. We started off with individual river civilizations, and now we see that globally we have a system that is starting to develop, a system of trade, a system of sharing ideas. This particular map is showing goods going across the various continents, right? And so, again, we've got our Silk Road, we've got shipping lanes identified, and the kinds of goods that you see moving about. So, from China, we have spices, right? Spices from China and precious stones moving about. From Arabia, here's Arabia here, right? From Arabia, your code says we've got not only spices and wine, but also precious metals and textiles. We've also got coinage, right? And timber moving through Arabia on the trade routes. You can add here in East Africa these amazing imports and exports, right? Here in Africa, Africa is exporting tortoise shell, right, for various products. It could be anything from ornament and combs. We have tortoiseshell combs to ideas about medicine. The same can be said for ivory. Then, of course, spices, incense, slaves, human cargo, wine, metals, textiles, glassware, yeah, and even coinage. So lots of exports coming out of Africa, lots of imports going into Africa, including weapons. Yeah. So do take a look at this map. I let you look at it at your leisure to try to see how different products are moving around the world through these trade routes. Not only different products, but certainly ideas as well, technology as well. These are just more trade routes in North Africa. We said in the earlier slide that Africa, East Africa, and Africa in general were trading tremendous amounts of materials, both import and export. Africa, a very rich continent. Some of these other images we have relate to African trade, but also Arabic trade. And here you have a nice rendition of caravan life, caravan trade coming out of the Arabic world. Caravan trade is a lifestyle that continues today. It's lucrative for the people who practice it. It's necessary for the people who live along the fringes of the deserts, both in North Africa and in Western Asia. And then we saw a modern map, and this map is interesting in that it is the kind of map that Muslim traders may have taken with them. This dates from the Middle Ages. And the difficult part about this map is that from our perspective, a Western perspective, south is up and north is down. So here's our Mediterranean, the different place that we might expect it to be. Here's the Atlantic, England, right? And then the Arabian Peninsula, a little bit larger perhaps than it should be, but that's because they're really interested to express the trade routes, and so they made it a little larger. They know those trade routes. Here's India, China, and then here's Europe, which they don't know as much about. They haven't traveled it as well. So why bring this up? Map making is a kind of technology, a kind of science. While it might not be as precise as we have today, might not be as accurate as we have today, it is an indication of the kinds of technology that are developing as a result of trade and communication routes. We mentioned the Netherlands earlier when we were talking about Europe, and also as we get into this more complicated 1200s, 1300s, we see very impressive trade routes here in Northwest Europe. So before we had the Vikings, now we have the Netherlands. The Netherlands will become perhaps the most important trade center in Europe well up until the 17th century, when England sort of takes that over. Now I throw this map in for you because, again, we're thinking about map making as the result of trade. It's a science, a technology that develops as we begin to explore more of the world. And this one is of Calicut, that's in India. This is a European map, and it shows the port and a great river, right? It shows a European sailing ship coming in. It shows locals coming out to greet this ship. Now, again, they're not perhaps in the right perspective, right? They might be a little too large. Then you've got someone over here working on a ship, right? And then they're showing extraordinary urban living here along the coastline. So this is a way for traders from Europe who might be interested in India to have some kind of idea of how to get there. And so here we are, and this is in a ship captain or someone on that ship and their rendition of what this port here actually looks like. Again, for a sailor who's made it all the way around the world to India, from Europe to India, you'd be thinking, wow, when I get there, there will be resources, there will be people, and they are technologically advanced. When we move into the 1600s and the 1700s, we're going to see more and more technology, more and more science applied to communication, travel, and this time the great oceans, moving into the open sea lanes. And so we won't have much time in this little video presentation to talk more about this, but know that that's coming, and that same concern about communication, about trade, that economic driver for trade is going to be one of the things that pushes technology, these science, if you will, of navigation, and eventually the idea that we need some way to measure distances around the globe. And it's going to take some time, but one of the most exciting scientific stories of the modern era is this idea of how do we measure both latitude and longitude. Latitude was pretty easy for us. Longitude was difficult. Longitude is, you've got to figure out some way to measure the time between the various longitude lines. And you're thinking, oh, well, why not just use a clock? Well, you can. At the time, it was a pendulum clock, and pendulum clocks did not work well on ships. You need a steady surface for that to work. So developments have to come forward on developing good clocks, good timepieces. We come to this map as we get close to the end of this presentation because we're seeing here as we move into the 16th century, as we move further in time, the extraordinary technological advances that are going to come to Europe that will allow people like the Portuguese, the Spanish, to engage in extraordinary travel and communication. As you can see from the center here, we've got Spain and Portugal primarily. Then we also have Britain jumping in as well. This is with Cabot in 1497. But we've got extraordinary voyages coming out of this region here. We're going to go along the coast of Africa first, trying to keep Africa in sight as we go along. The first explorers will set up little depots along the way of Africa in order to supply themselves for future voyages, and then eventually make the leap over to India and China, and then getting over to Japan as well, right? We're also going to see, as we take a greater look, that we're going to see people going across, beginning with Columbus, going across, Columbus and Magellan, going across to the Americas, and then eventually figuring out how to navigate that direction in order to make it, again, to the source of some of these extraordinary products that we find in China and India. This will take much larger sailing ships than humans have known before. This will take much more ability to understand, to chart the seas, to chart the various currents that send ships either straight down south or right across, and you can see this extraordinary trade winds represented here. You've got to understand trade winds, you've got to understand currents, and this is going to take some effort for these early explorers. It's going to be the collected information, the collected assessment and evaluation of that information along these trade routes, along these communication routes, that's going to lead to some extraordinary developments both in technology and in science. I throw this last one in to take a look at because this is a map drawn from the perspective now of the peoples being introduced to these outside sources. In the past, it was Europeans doing map making, Muslims doing map making, who are charting new places, who are getting out there and exploring. This is from the perspective of the African peoples who see these Europeans coming in. So a little cruder perhaps, a little cruder perhaps. But the other thing that we start to see is not only influences of perhaps weapons coming in, right? But also influence of religion coming in. So we have flags being planted, crosses, and perhaps churches or castles. Hard to tell with this one, right? And ships coming in. But again, a very basic kind of crude drawing of the port of Fort Jesus or Jesus at Mombasa, Africa, and to show that some of this map making and these interesting pictorials, this technology is starting to diffuse into other cultures besides those who originally created it. So I leave you with these ideas, this development of technology that led to more communication, whether it was roads or canals, shipbuilding, map making, right? So we get more and more communication. We get communication of goods, communication and transportation of peoples, but also of technology. And again, some of the other lessons that we'll have in this particular segment, we'll talk about how the shared technology from China, from India, is going to speed up, if you will, what will become the scientific revolution in Europe. All of these things, this global perspective, these global contacts, are going to contribute to what becomes what we have come to know as the scientific revolution. It's an event that happens only in Europe, only in this age of discovery, and it's an extraordinary story. It's an extraordinary event that makes us who we are today.